When American and Soviet troops started tracking Nazi leaders to make them stand trial at Nuremberg, most of the times they could only find their wives. The husbands were either dead or had fled the country. A fierce debate followed over what should be done with these scared women. Were they witnesses, innocent bystanders, accomplices, or perpetrators? All of them claimed innocence, playing the role of mere devoted housewives who cared for their children and their husbands. In some cases this was true, but for most of them, the reality was much more sinister. These women are among the vilest and most unrepenting women in history, the Nazi princesses who loved German war criminals. They were all affiliated to the Nazi Party, sometimes long before meeting their spouses, and in most cases survived them, keeping the flame of anti-Semitism and racialism alive. Learn what tragic fates awaited these wives, mothers, and mistresses after their beloved Third Reich lost World War II. Welcome to the Marshall Memoirs. Gerda Bormann, the devil's devoted wife. Not all the wives of Nazi leaders were Nazis themselves. Gerda Bormann, however, was absolutely devoted to the ideology and the party of Adolf Hitler and was arguably the first Nazi princess in history. She was born in 1909 in Konstanz, in a family of Nazi enthusiasts. It was his father, Walter Buch, who introduced young Gerda to Uncle Adolf. If anything, Gerda was more fanatical than her father, something that would become clear after she became involved with a stocky, thick-necked man called Martin Bormann, who was a relative latecomer to the movement, joining the party in February 1927. He was briefly a press officer in his local area before moving into the SA, the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party. This is where he first came into contact with Gerda's father. Gerda fell madly in love with him, and the two married in 1929. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Bormann became the chief of staff of Rudolf Hess, and later became the personal secretary of Adolf Hitler, his career highlight. Gerda could not be prouder of his husband, and she also enjoyed the life upgrades that came with such high position while caring for 9 children, according to the Nazi ideal. The Soviet invasion put an end to her dream, however. As the Red Army closed in on Berlin in 1945, Gerda fled with her 9 children. She took advantage of the chaos, posing as the director of a children's home with 4 of her children disguised as orphans. The other 5 were taken by Martin Bormann in order to facilitate this escape, but seeing that he had no way out, he took his own life by biting into a pill of cyanide. His body, however, would not be found until much later, so at the moment the Allied investigators did not know of his demise. Meanwhile, Gerda boarded a school bus with the children and managed to cross the border into Italy, stopping in the South Tyrol where they were met by the Nazis' regional boss. He had secured a place to stash all Gerda's sensitive material and found them a home in a small village in a valley 30 miles from Bolzano. Though safe for the time being, Gerda was in dreadful agony. Her sister-in-law, who had made the journey with her, observed that Gerda, who was usually a very quiet person, now did not stop complaining about a pain she was suffering in the lower part of her body. Once settled in Bolzano, they found a local Italian doctor who immediately recognized the seriousness of her condition. Gerda was suffering from the advanced stages of ovarian cancer and needed an operation as soon as possible. By then, the Allies were on her trail. 2 intelligence agents tracked her down and informed the British unit stationed in the area. Having consulted the doctor who diagnosed Gerda, a British Army major turned up on her doorstep. Gerda panicked, thinking he was going to take her to a concentration camp, but the major assured her that she was in no danger. Instead, she went straight to a hospital for prisoners of war in Merano. Surgery took place, but without effect. Facing her imminent demise, Gerda sought solace in religion and converted to Catholicism. She died on the 23rd of March 1946, a few months shy of her 37th birthday. Mein Kampf's avid reader, Magda Goebbels. On the 1st of May 1945, Magda Goebbels might have envied Gerda Bormann, who was lucky enough to flee the country. As it turned out, she would never learn what happened to Gerda. Johanna Maria Magdalena Ritschl was born in 1901 and spent most of her childhood in Brussels, but was repatriated to Germany when World War I broke. In 1921, she married a wealthy German industrialist named Günther Quandt, who was twice her age at the time. In 1929, when Quandt discovered she had been unfaithful, he decided to end the marriage, leaving her a small fortune and a luxurious flat in Berlin in the process. While in Berlin at that time, it was impossible to ignore the daily clashes between the Nazis and their opponents. Urged on by several friends, Magda attended a large Nazi rally where the main speaker was Joseph Goebbels. Other than Hitler, Goebbels was the Nazis' most effective public speaker, whipping up the audience as he went, bristling with aggression. He was extremely intelligent and highly educated, with a PhD in literature from Heidelberg University. But he was also a small man, had a clubfoot and a pronounced limp. Magda did not pay attention to this, but felt attracted to his voice and ideas. She immediately joined the party and bought a copy of Mein Kampf and the Myth of the 20th Century, a rambling mishmash written by Nazi philosopher Alfred Rosenberg. Magda quickly became leader of the local Nazi women's group, but her presence caused friction with the other members, who objected to taking orders from such an overprivileged lady. Frustrated, Magda set her sights higher and applied for work at Goebbels' propaganda department, where he couldn't fail to notice her. Struck by Magda's obvious class and beauty, Goebbels asked her to take responsibility for his private archive, hoping that working in such close proximity would make it easier for him to seduce her. By late February 1931, Magda and Goebbels had begun sleeping together. A relationship developed, and by April they were making plans for their future together. Her apartment on Theodor Heuss Platz soon became one of the main meeting places for Adolf Hitler and other Nazi officials. This brought the Goebbels some problems, as Joseph became jealous of the attention Hitler gave Magda. The fact that Magda was also infatuated with Hitler did the couple no good, but it was also the main reason why she married Goebbels, to be closer to the Führer. On the 19th of December 1931, Goebbels and Magda, who was already pregnant, got married at a civil ceremony followed by a church service. Hitler was best man. When Magda thanked him with a kiss, his eyes were full of tears. On the 1st of September 1932, their first daughter, Helga, was born. It was a harrowing experience for Magda, who afterwards felt exhausted and very weak. Her doctor explained that giving birth had aggravated a pre-existing heart condition of hers, so she should be careful in the future. Despite this, and before being fully recovered, she became pregnant again, but suffered a miscarriage in December. The couple spent that New Year's Eve in Hitler's cottage at Obersalzberg. This was a bad idea, as Magda had caught an infection and developed a terribly high fever. She survived, but from that point, and until the end of her life, she would be seriously limited in her movements. During the war, Magda trained as a Red Cross nurse, despite her weak heart and delicate health, which forced her to spend long periods bedridden at home. When in late 1945 Soviet troops entered Berlin, the Goebbels family moved into a subterranean bunker that was connected to Hitler's bunker. On the afternoon of April 30th, they met with Hitler and Eva Braun for the last time. Then Magda and Goebbels retreated to their own bunker to spend a last supper together. The following day, May 1st, SS dentist Helmut Kunz was instructed to inject their 6 children with morphine one by one to make them unconscious. After that, a capsule of cyanide was slipped in each of the children's mouth and crushed. When all of the children were dead, Joseph and Magda walked out of the bunker and into the Chancellery's garden, where they also took their own lives. Goebbels had instructed an SS officer to shoot their bodies to make sure they were dead, and then douse the bodies with gasoline and light them. Their charred remains were found the following day by Soviet troops. Philosophy, literature, and mass murder. The life of Ilse Pröhl. One evening, young and wealthy Ilse Pröhl ran into one of her neighbors in Munich, a tall young man wearing a tattered uniform who introduced himself as Rudolf Hess. She was immediately struck by his appearance, the thick eyebrows, the sunken eyes, and haunted expression. She was instantly attracted to him. Whether the 26-year-old Hess had a similar reaction is impossible to say. Of all the senior Nazis, Hess was the most enigmatic. Along his life, it would become clear that he suffered from mental problems from a very early age. He was also a decorated war hero who had been wounded twice in battle. Ilse decided to pursue him, and they began spending time together. They became good friends, as their affair was purely platonic. Still a virgin, Hess showed absolutely no interest in sex. For the next few years, their relationship lacked a physical dimension, which frustrated Ilse. Instead, they cultivated a spiritual connection based on their shared love of German culture, especially the Romantic writers and composers of the late 18th and early 19th century. Ilse's favorite writer was Friedrich Hölderlin. By the autumn of 1920, Ilse had completed her secondary studies, begun a part-time university course in German and library science, and started work at an antiquarian bookshop. Aside from occasional trips outside Munich to visit the countryside, she spent the majority of her spare time working for the Nazi movement, delivering leaflets, putting up posters, helping out with the party newspaper and acting as Hess's secretary while he attached himself to Hitler and put his body on the line during the frequent brawls between Nazi supporters and their left-wing opponents. In recognition of their efforts, Ilse and Hess were granted the privilege of being around Hitler during his free time. Eventually, Hess and Hitler became very good friends. In 1923, Hess was one of the loyal soldiers who fought alongside Hitler during the failed beer hall putsch in Munich. Fearing capture, Hess telephoned Ilse to inform her that he would attempt to cross the border into Austria, which he did. Later, he came back to Germany to visit Ilse, but he was captured and imprisoned together with Hitler and other instigators. Ilse never failed to show up every Saturday when Hess was allowed 6 hours visiting time. Hess would value Ilse's loyalty his whole life. After Hess's imprisonment, Ilse and Rudolf got married in 1927, and their only child was born in 1937. By that time, Hess was appointed Reichsminister, and he spent long hours working. When the war started in 1939, he became increasingly paranoid and his mental health declined, until in 1941 he decided to fly solo into Scotland in the hopes of negotiating a peace treaty directly with the British government. The British authorities put him into a POW prison instead, and after finding out the news, Ilse took his son and retreated to a town called Hindelang to be away from Munich and Hitler's fury against Rudolf, who was considered a deserter. Rudolf Hess was one of the first Nazis to be prosecuted and sentenced in the Nuremberg trials, and on the 3rd of June 1947, Ilse Hess was arrested in Munich. Like all the wives of the war criminals condemned or executed during the Nuremberg trials, she was transferred to an internment camp in Göttingen. On the 24th of March 1948, she was released and settled down in the Bavarian Alps, where she opened a guest house in 1955. Rudolf was serving a life sentence in the Spandau prison, which she visited in the weekends. Ilse had always been a dedicated Nazi. Until her death at the age of 95, she remained loyal to Hitler and his views, and after the war she became a well-respected author. She published a popular book in 1952 and followed it up in 1954 with a book titled Rudolf Hess, Prisoner of Peace, the first of a series of collections of her correspondence with her husband. Upon his death in 1995, he asked to be buried next to his husband in Wunsiedel, Bavaria. Margaret Himmler, the silent collaborator. Margaret Boden met Heinrich Himmler during a 3-hour train journey from Munich to Berlin. They struck up a conversation, and by the end of the ride, a connection had been made. Having gone their separate ways, they began exchanging letters, an almost daily habit that would continue throughout their relationship, largely because they were more often apart than together. Margaret was 8 years older than Himmler. From a comfortable landowning family, she was just old enough to join the German Red Cross in 1914 and become a nurse. After completing her training, she was deployed to a field hospital. Soon after the war ended, she married Himmler. Their wedding plans depended on Margaret selling her share of property she inherited and using the money to purchase a plot of land. They were going to become farmers. This was Himmler's long-cherished ambition. But Hitler had other plans for one of his most loyal associates. Himmler went on to have a successful career in the Nazi Party, becoming chief of police, leader of the Waffen-SS and Minister of the Interior during Hitler's presidency. Himmler was also responsible for overseeing the Jew extermination programs. In May 1945, Himmler and Margaret parted ways and promised to meet again abroad. Himmler was captured and bit into a cyanide capsule, dying almost instantly. Margaret and their daughter Gudrun left the town of Gmund as Allied troops advanced into the area. After the invasion of Bolzano, Italy, by the US Army in May 1945, Margaret and Gudrun were arrested. They were held in various internment camps in Italy, France, and Germany. During her internment, Margaret was interrogated. but it became clear that she was not informed of the official business of her husband. Later that year, she was called to testify at the Nuremberg trials, where she also claimed innocence. She and Gudrun were released in November 1946 from internment. They took refuge for a time with the Bethel Institution of Bielefeld. Margaret maintained that while she had been the wife of Himmler, she remained far from the spotlight. Nevertheless, the Allied committee that monitored her actions was convinced that she likely supported the goals of the Nazi Party and endorsed the actions of her husband. Her lawyer insisted during the follow-up appeals process that Margaret could not be responsible for the actions of her husband. Between 1948 and 1953, Margaret was involved in 3 different trials. The final outcome was that a judge finally decided that she was not to be held accountable for the crimes of her husband, despite that she had not been distant from them. On the 15th of January 1953, she was classified as a beneficiary of the Nazi regime and sentenced to 30 days punitive work. She also lost her pension rights and the right to vote. Their daughter Gudrun left Bethel in 1952, and from the autumn of 1955 onward, Margaret lived with her sister Lydia in Heapen. Margaret told Lydia that all she hoped for was a quiet life and was content to disappear into obscurity. That is exactly what she did, and when she died on the 25th of August 1967, at the age of 74, she took all her husband's secrets with her, including all his affairs. Sleeping with evil, Hedwig Potthast. In fact, as Margaret Himmler once confessed to one of the American interrogators, her husband had never been very faithful. His most famous affair was with his 26-year-old secretary, Hedwig Potthast. Born on the 6th of February 1912 to middle-class parents who put her through a high-end secondary school where she learned English, Hedwig subsequently got her degree at the Economics Institute for Interpreters in Mannheim. Graduating in 1932, she ended up getting a job as a clerk in a post office. Bored and seeking a challenge, Hedwig applied for a position with the Gestapo's press department in autumn 1935. This was still not enough to satisfy her ambitions, and in January 1936 she became Himmler's personal secretary. Hedwig's friends called her Bunny because she was always friendly and upbeat, 2 things Margaret Himmler had never been. Hedwig enjoyed gymnastics and rowing. She was popular with her colleagues. In October 1937, she joined other members of staff for Himmler's birthday at Lake Tegernsee and was welcomed into the SS family. As they worked in close proximity, Hedwig and Himmler's relationship developed, and sometime over Christmas 1938, they admitted their feelings for each other. Himmler discussed his affair directly with Hitler, who was famously avert to marriage but also to divorce. He recommended Himmler to continue the relationship, but secretly. For some reason, Himmler did not do this. Instead, he told his wife in 1941 that he had a mistress and that he wanted to have children with her. Margaret was sorely bitter, but nonetheless accepted the fact and continued being Himmler's wife. Hedwig had to resign from her duties in 1941, and the Nazi Party found her a place to live in the Mecklenburg Forest, about an hour north of Berlin. Hedwig and Himmler had 2 children, a boy and a girl. In 1944, he bought her a cottage near Berchtesgaden, where Hitler's famous Eagle's Nest was located. There she led a bizarre life. Once she was visited by Gerda Bormann and her children. According to Gerda, after tea, Hedwig invited them all to the attic to see something special, furniture made from human body parts. Hedwig explained in detail the process behind the construction of a chair whose seat was a human pelvis, and the legs were human legs that sat on real human feet. Hedwig also had copies of Mein Kampf bound with human skin that had been peeled off the backs of Dachau inmates. Gerda remembered that Himmler tried to give Bormann a similarly unique edition of Mein Kampf, but he refused to take it. Gerda said it was too much for him. After World War II, Potthast remarried and lived the rest of her life outside the public eye. In post-war interviews, she refrained from answering questions about Himmler's involvement in war crimes committed by the Nazis or about her own knowledge of them. When she learned about the death of Himmler on the radio, she went into hiding, living temporarily with Eleanor Pohl in Rosenheim, Upper Bavaria. She was arrested that same year by members of the US Army and interrogated for several days in Munich. She claimed complete innocence and wasn't prosecuted. For the rest of her life, she remained quiet about his involvement with Himmler and away from the press. When Himmler's daughter Gudrun found out about her and about her half-siblings, she tried to make contact with them, but Hedwig refused it. Little information of his post-war life is known, apart from the fact that she died on the 22nd of September 1994, aged 82, in the city of Baden-Baden. Gudrun Himmler, the angel-faced neo-Nazi. The third Himmler girl was Gudrun, Heinrich and Margaret's only child. She was famous among his father's acquaintances because everyone thought she embodied the ideal of the pure German race, with her blonde, braided hair and her delicate facial features. As the only child of one of the most prominent families in the Nazi cabinet, she enjoyed a luxurious and happy childhood until the end of the war. As did other Nazi princesses, she and her mother would try to sneak past the southern border into South Tyrol. But as explained before, on the 13th of May 1945, Margaret and her daughter were discovered in the Tyrol and taken into custody by the Allies. They spent 2 nights at an American-run hotel near Bolzano, 1 night in Verona, flew to Florence and ended their journey in a British-run camp and interrogation center near Rome, where they were the only female prisoners. From Rome, she and Gudrun were transported to Nuremberg. On arrival, Margaret was strip-searched, and a vial of potassium cyanide was found stitched into the shoulder padding of her coat. Margaret and Gudrun were placed in a bare cell with 2 planks for beds. Recognizing that Nuremberg jail wasn't exactly an ideal environment for a teenage girl, Colonel Andrus from the US Army attempted to make Gudrun's time there as normal as possible. Nevertheless, Gudrun was interrogated on the 22nd of September 1945. She was asked about her final meeting with her father and whether she traveled round a lot during the war years. The disciplined and angel-like Gudrun replied that she'd spent the last 5 years either at home or at school. She talked briefly about her tour of the Dachau herb plantation, and when she was questioned about whether her parents had ever discussed their post-war plans or anything else of significance, Gudrun's response was that they never told her anything at all. The interrogators believed her. After the war, Gudrun married far-right propagandist and author Wolf-Dieter Burwitz, who later became a party official in the Bavarian section of the far-right National Democratic Party, or NPD. Now turned into a bona fide Nazi princess, Gudrun became an advocate for far-right causes. She found validation among the ranks of Silent Help, an organization that helped former SS members. She worked tirelessly on its behalf for over 40 years, and its members treated her with a degree of respect and admiration that bordered on reverence. At the same time, Gudrun helped to set up a barely legal neo-Nazi group for her own generation called the Viking Youth. In 1958, Gudrun attended a gathering of SS veterans and fellow travelers held in Austria near an ancient Celtic site deep in the Bohemian forests. Gudrun was the guest of honor at what would become an annual celebration of her father's achievements. From 1961 to 1963, she worked under a fake name as a secretary for West Germany's Bureau of Intelligence, or BND. At the time, the agency was headed by Reinhard Gehlen, an American recruited general who hired, among others, ex-Nazis to work for BND based on their connections and experience with Eastern Europe and anti-communist activities. Gudrun died in 2018, clinging to the belief that Himmler had done no wrong. Hedwig Hensel, more than just a housewife. Not much is known about Hedwig, the wife of Rudolf Höss, commander of the death camps at Auschwitz, apart from the fact that she was always a very reserved and quiet woman. Her life came into scrutiny recently, as it was the main topic of Jonathan Glazer's award-winning film, The Zone of Interest. There she is portrayed as a typical German housewife who was in charge of a large household while her husband worked long hours. She was born in 1908 in Neukirch, Germany, making her one of the youngest Nazi princesses of World War II. At 21, she became forever entangled with one of the darkest chapters in human history through her marriage to Rudolf Höss. The couple settled down and had 5 children: Klaus, Annegret, Heidetraut, Ingeborg, and Hans Rudolf. While taking care of the children, she accompanied her husband's meteoric rise within the ranks of the Nazi Party, right until he was appointed commandant of Auschwitz in 1940. The family moved into a villa located just a few kilometers from the camp, a stark contrast of domesticity and unimaginable barbarity. For this reason, historians are still debating the extent to which she was actually aware of the horrors that were happening literally next door to her house. Some claim she remained blissfully ignorant, sheltered by her husband and the trappings of a privileged life within the Nazi hierarchy. Others, however, suggest cracks in this facade. Many camp survivors have testified to seeing Hedwig on horseback near the camp, and some accounts claim she received gifts of furs and jewelry, potentially looted from victims. Whether she chose not to know or actively participated in a willful ignorance to maintain a comfortable life is a question that is difficult to answer. As Allied forces closed in on Germany in 1945, Hiss attempted to disappear. Hedwig, however, stayed behind with their children. She thought it would seem suspicious if she fled and chose rather to stay at home and feign ignorance. She was eventually captured and interrogated by the British. Her testimony offers little insight, leaving historians to grapple with the extent of her knowledge. This strategy evidently paid off, as Hedwig Hensel was never charged with any crimes. She did not even tell her own children that their father had been hanged at Auschwitz. Her daughter, Ingebrigit Hiss, moved to Franco's Spain, where she worked as a fashion model and met her future husband. Together they moved to United States, where they eventually settled down in Arlington, Virginia. It was during a visit to Ingebrigit that Hedwig Hiss died on the 15th of September 1989. She was buried under an anonymous tombstone that only says the word Mutti, meaning mommy in German. Hitler's biggest fan, Lina Heydrich. While Hedwig Hiss had always been reserved about her own political views, other Nazi princesses were much more vocal in her rejection of Jews and racially inferior peoples. One of the youths that flocked to Hitler's banner in the early 1920s was the teenager Lina von Osten, whose older brother was already a confirmed Nazi supporter. He asked young Lina to accompany him to a party meeting, and that was all she needed to become convinced of the superiority of Hitler's ideas. She was especially interested in the fact that Hitler's movement was geared towards the young, unlike the rest of ancient Prussian politics. She was also a notable anti-Semite. She decided to change her life and abandoned her family home on the island of Fehmarn, very close to Denmark. Lina came from a wealthy family whose fortune dwindled during the hyperinflation of the early 1920s. Having decided to become a teacher herself, Lina headed to the mainland port of Kiel to complete her training at a technical high school, staying at a boarding house for female students. As she neared the end of her course, Lina and a few friends attended a ball on the 6th of December 1930, and it was during what was otherwise a dull evening that Lina met 27-year-old naval officer Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich was tall, blonde, with an athlete's build and no doubt impressive in a uniform, but he also had an abnormally large head, narrow eyes, a small mouth and jug ears. Lina found him intriguing and agreed to a meeting the next day. Beyond the powerful physical attraction between them, Lina and Heydrich shared some key characteristics. Both were fixed on escaping their backgrounds and forging a different destiny for themselves. They were stubborn and extremely ambitious and felt that the majority of people were inferior beings. Lina was a fervent Nazi before meeting Heydrich and would frequently complain that her husband had not even read Mein Kampf. When he was discharged from the Navy on account of his relationship with Lina, she urged him to join the newly created SS. After a meeting with Himmler himself, he was hired in the spot to act as the chief of the SS's intelligence service. He would go on to have a successful career in the SS, but was assassinated during the war for his role in the occupation of Czechoslovakia. Lina Heydrich was interrogated after the war, but despite her obvious commitment to the Nazi cause, no crimes could be imputed on her, so she was cleared. She later filed a series of court cases against the government of West Germany in 1956 and 1959, awarding her the right to receive a pension. Because her husband, despite being a war criminal, had been a German police general killed in action, she was entitled to a substantial pension. In Czechoslovakia, Lina was tried in absentia and sentenced to life imprisonment, but this was never enforced. She remarried in 1965 to a Finnish playwright and theatre director who died tragically 4 years later. Lina continued to live until 1985, having published several books and newspaper articles where he defended her late husband. The two wives of Hermann Göring. Hermann Göring is the only man in this list to have married twice. Nazi officers had to follow a strict code of conduct, which meant they needed to keep their affairs private, and if they married someone, divorce was never an option. Because of Göring's elite background, Hitler considered him a valuable asset. He could open doors to the military elite and aristocracy. These were local power brokers who could help Hitler realize his immediate ambition to use Munich as the starting point of a national revolution. When they were introduced in late 1922, Hitler himself invited Göring to join the movement. Göring was not particularly convinced of Hitler's ideas, but he was deeply moved by the Führer's ability to mobilize the masses. In this sense, the fledgling Nazi party offered Göring an opportunity to be a big fish in a small pond. But it was Göring's new Swedish wife Karin who sealed the deal. Already a confirmed anti-Semite, Karin worshipped the ground Hitler walked on. To her, Hitler was like a mythical superhero from a Norse legend. Karin did everything in her power to cement the relationship between the two men, and she succeeded as Göring became one of the main Nazi party members, later creating the Gestapo and being appointed commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force. Göring would always remember how supportive his first wife had been of his career in the Nazi ranks. Karin and Göring's romantic love story was used by the propaganda machine of Goebbels, and the couple would show themselves together around the country to boost the popularity of the Nazi party. But Karin was sickly, suffering from tuberculosis by her early 40s. When her mother, Huldine Fock, died unexpectedly on September 1931, it came as a great shock to the 42-year-old Karin. Although her health was still fragile, she went to Sweden for her mother's funeral, but suffered a heart attack the very next day at Stockholm. Göring was informed and immediately joined her there, staying at her side until she died of heart failure on the 17th of October 1931, 4 days before her 43rd birthday. Göring continued to ascend the ranks of the Nazi party, as it was what Karin would have wanted. During one of his tours, he met 38-year-old actress Emmy Sonnemann. Emmy was quite the opposite to Karin in everything but in beauty. Emmy liked to portray herself as an artist with no feeling for politics and claimed she did her best to avoid discussing Göring's work. She was much happier talking to him about theatre, books, paintings, and human relationships. She had wanted to be an actress ever since she saw a production of The Merchant of Venice when she was 12. Her father, an affluent entrepreneur who owned a chocolate factory, was against her acting career, but her mother was more sympathetic. Despite her pretended disinterest for politics, Emmy Göring was nicknamed the First Lady of the Third Reich. Thanks to Göring's contacts and Goebbels' propaganda machine, Emmy became one of the most respected and well-known actresses in the Reich. Like Göring and Karin before, now Göring and Emmy were the first couple of the Reich. But this also sealed her destiny. Lina Heydrich may have been a convinced Nazi, but despite her disinterest for politics, Emmy's high profile earned her a conviction to 1 year in jail after the war, and she had 30% of her assets seized by the Allied government. She was also banned from the stage for 5 years. Some years after her release from jail, Emmy Göring settled down in a very small flat in the city of Munich and remained there for the rest of her life. Hitler's toxic love, Eva Braun. In 1930, Adolf Hitler asked his close associate Martin Bormann to meet in secret. He had an important thing to ask him. Once alone, Hitler gave him a task that required secrecy and discretion. He asked Bormann to check out the ancestry of a 17-year-old girl whom Hitler had met at Heinrich Hoffmann's photographic studio, where she was working as an assistant. Hitler had taken a shine to her and wanted to know if she was from good Aryan stock. After completing a thorough investigation, Bormann was able to confirm that Eva Braun did not have a drop of Jewish blood. Hitler was relieved. The only problem was, Hitler already had a romantic, albeit toxic, relationship with his half-niece, Geli Raubal. Geli was only 22 at the time, while Hitler was 20 years older than her. He was extremely protective of her, making Geli feel controlled and under surveillance. After 1927, when Hitler learned of an affair she had with a chauffeur, he determined that she would not be left alone with any man other than himself. This was devastating for poor Geli, who did not know what to do. On the evening of the 18th of September 1931, while Hitler was in Nuremberg, Geli took the gun he'd given her for protection, placed the muzzle against her chest and fired. She fell to the floor, slowly bleeding to death. Hitler felt devastated, but with Geli out of the picture, he was free to pursue a relationship with Eva. Hitler had strong sentiments against marriage, so until the very end of their lives, he denied this possibility to Eva, who requested to get married in multiple occasions. Eva embodied Hitler's ideal of natural womanhood. A true blonde, she was athletic and sporty. She practiced gymnastics and swimming and kept herself in shape. She had almost no interest in politics or the state of the nation. She had few airs or graces and was refreshingly free-spirited. She was emotionally immature and easy for Hitler to manipulate. From her point of view, Hitler was courteous, often charming, indulgent and attentive, while his growing fame flattered and excited her. Eva hadn't yet grasped how cruel and indifferent Hitler could be towards those who dared get close to him. By 1932, she would be deeply aware of his disinterest. Having given herself to Hitler, Eva endlessly waited for him to pay her some attention, but Hitler was barely in Munich during that year. Even when he was, he had precious little time for her. Eva took his absences and silences personally as a sign of rejection. Anxiety turned to despair. Like Gelly before her, she had her own pistol. Leaving a scribbled farewell note, she put the gun to her head and pulled the trigger. The bullet lodged in her neck, just missing the artery. Bleeding profusely, Eva managed to call a doctor who came immediately and got her to hospital, where the bullet was successfully removed. Whether this was a call for attention or an honest attempt to take her life, it worked. Hitler was shocked into action. He vowed that he'd take better care of her. Eva would suffer greatly from Hitler's absences. He often forgot her birthday and cancelled appointments at the last minute. Despite that, Eva would remain at the Führer's side until the bitter end. After Eva's life attempt, Hitler went out of his way to accommodate her. In August of 1935, he rented a 3-bedroom apartment for Eva and her sister. The following March, Hitler bought her a 2-story villa and a new car. More importantly for Eva, she was given the room adjoining Hitler's at the Berghof. It took her a while, and there were continued restrictions on her freedom of movement, but at the Berghof, she came into her own. During the final days of the war, as the Soviet army was fast approaching Berlin, Hitler, Eva, and other Nazi commanders retreated to underground bunkers. Feeling the end draw near, and as a token of appreciation for Eva's many years of unwavering support, Hitler conceded her a long-standing wish of her own. Hitler made his personal secretary, Martin Bormann, conduct a small civil ceremony where he married Eva. The ceremony took place in an enclosed concrete environment. It didn't matter. The following day, they would be dead. Eva spent the rest of her wedding day saying the final goodbyes to those remaining in the bunker, as news of Mussolini's public execution began to reach the bunker. There was no apparent escape. It was then when Hitler sat by Eva and discussed their final decisions. They made a pact to end each other's lives, to which she agreed. There was no point in living, she claimed, if he was not by her side. As is publicly known, the details surrounding the actual deaths of Hitler and Eva Braun are unclear. It is commonly accepted that Hitler shot himself in the head after he witnessed Eva ingesting a cyanide capsule. SS soldiers had been instructed to carry the bodies outside, douse them in gasoline and light them on fire. The remains were to be buried in a shallow pit in the Chancellery Garden. The following day, when Soviet troops stormed the bunker, they found the charred corpses and secretly carried them back to the Soviet Union, without ever publicly confirming that they belonged to Hitler and Eva Braun. For this reason, it was long thought that both Hitler and Eva had somehow escaped Berlin and fled to South America or elsewhere. Only much later, in the 1970s, the Soviets acknowledged having taken Hitler's and Eva's body, although by that time there were no more remains available to study, as they had been completely destroyed. One of the last things Eva did before reaching the end of her life was to write a letter. In that letter, addressed to her sister Gretl, she reminisced on her life and concluded that it had been a happy life. Among the things that made her happy, she said, was to be able to die at the side of the Führer, and to be spared the horrors that were to come to her, the most conspicuous woman of the Third Reich. Eva slipped the letter into an envelope and gave it to Hannah Reich, a hero aviator woman who was also among the last persons to see Hitler alive, as she was married to his personal doctor. Gretl Braun's journey from stardom to obscurity. Close to the end of the war in 1944, one of Himmler's protégés, Hermann Fegelein, a dashing but sadistic SS cavalry officer, got married to a young woman named Gretl Braun. 6 months later, as the Soviet army massed on the borders of the Reich, Fegelein deserted Gretl and was preparing to flee Berlin with another woman and some stolen gold bars when he was apprehended by the SS and executed. Gretl, heavily pregnant at the time, pleaded with Eva for her husband's life, but to no avail. Fegelein was executed just hours before Hitler and Eva committed suicide. Gretl had been part of Hitler's inner circle since 1930, when she and her sister met the Führer. They immediately became frequent visitors of Hitler's many residences. Gretl's early life had been comfortable. Her father, Hedwig Braun, was a school teacher, and the family enjoyed a middle-class existence. She always had a close relationship with her younger sister, Eva, and both were known for their beauty and outgoing personalities. After the war, Gretl faced the harsh realities of a fallen regime. She was ostracized for her association with the Nazis and struggled to rebuild her life. She gave birth to a daughter, Eva Barbara, named after her deceased sister. Gretl chose a life of quiet obscurity. She rarely spoke about her past, perhaps burdened by the weight of her family's legacy. She worked as a secretary and eventually married again in 1958, taking the name Gretl Braun Lobinger. Her daughter, Eva Barbara, tragically lost her boyfriend in a car accident in 1971, after which she took her own life. Gretl Braun passed away in 1987, leaving behind a life forever marked, like many of the women on this list, by her proximity to some of history's most monstrous figures. As in the case of the other so-called Nazi princesses, it may be argued that they were young at the time and simply enjoyed the life of luxury attached to being close to powerful men. But this would be deceitful. The truth is, most of these women, Gretl and Eva included, were accomplices and many times collaborators in the Nazis' criminal endeavors. Far from being innocent housewives, these 12 Nazi princesses were all convinced anti-Semites and racial supremacists. They often supported their husbands, discussed with them the atrocities they were perpetrating in the battlefield and in the death camps, and even pushed them to go further. After the war ended, some like Eva Braun and Magda Goebbels took their own lives, while others faced imprisonment as accomplices to the many war crimes of Nazi officials. Whatever the case was, one thing is certain, and that is that these women were in part responsible for some of the worst crimes in the history of mankind.